Hello everyone, today I'll discuss how US President Trump staged a photo op during negotiations with Japan. After China retaliated against US tariffs, America's energy exports to China in June dropped to zero. If there's a tax cut, it must be a mutual reduction between China and US. In June, China's imports of three main energy products from US dropped to almost zero. According to Bloomberg, after China imposed retaliatory tariffs of 10% to 15% on U.S. imports of crude oil, liquefied natural gas, and coal in February, the volume of these three goods exported from the U.S. to China showed a downward trend. The report, citing data from China's General Administration of Customs, shows that in June, U.S. crude oil exported to China dropped to zero for the first time in 3 years. Crude oil is the most traded commodity in global trade, and China is the world's largest importer of crude oil. The report states that China's imports of U.S. liquefied natural gas were the first to drop to zero. By June, U.S. liquefied natural gas imports by China remained at zero for 4 consecutive months. China's purchases of U.S. coal also dwindled to almost nothing. In June, U.S. coal exports to China dropped from $90 million last year to a few $1 for 2 consecutive months. Last year, the value of U.S. crude oil exports to China dropped by 46% year-on-year, but still amounted to about $6.35 billion. Last year, the value of U.S. natural gas exports to China was about $2.13 billion, while U.S. coal exports to China reached $1.98 billion. Combined, these three energy exports to China totaled $10.46 billion last year. In recent years, as China-US relations deteriorated, China actively diversified its energy import sources, reducing U.S. imports. For total imports, Saudi Arabia and Russia top China's crude oil suppliers, while the U.S. ranks 10th. Additionally, since the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war, Russia has become an important supplier of cheap natural gas to China. Yi Lin, vice president of commodity market analysis at Cosmos Energy, said that China's suspension of crude oil and other energy imports from the United States reflects a strategic shift toward other suppliers. In addition, a high cost of long-distance transportation is also one of the factors China is considering. U.S. Treasury Secretary Bessent revealed on July 22 that Chinese and American trade officials will hold a third round of talks next week in Stockholm, the capital of Sweden, and may discuss further extending the tariff suspension period. Bessent said that this round of talks will cover a broader range of topics, including urging China to reduce its excessive reliance on manufacturing and exports, and to stop purchasing Russian and Iranian oil that is under U.S. embargo. It seems that the U.S. wants to ask China to buy less energy products from Russia and Iran, and to increase its purchases of American products. The U.S. has been waging a global tariff war mainly to reduce its trade deficit. In 2024, the U.S. trade deficit with China was $295 billion, down 30% from last year's century high of $418 billion. But China is still the largest source of America's trade deficit. But if China doesn't buy American energy products, it's believed that the U.S. trade deficit with China will grow rather than shrink. China is also the only country that can impose retaliatory tariffs on the United States. When the U.S. first imposed a so-called 20% shared tariff on China, China responded by slapping an additional 10% to 15% tariff on American energy and agricultural products. With additional tariffs, both sides imposed reciprocal tariffs of 10%. However, China imposed 20% to 25% tariffs on highly substitutable American energy products. How could China buy energy products with such high tariffs? Imports dropped to zero, a real pain point for the U.S. In future China-U.S. negotiations, the tariffs China imposed on American energy and agricultural products will be a topic of discussion. But if the U.S. doesn't reduce those 20% shared tariffs, China won't lower the additional 10% to 15% tariffs on American energy and agricultural products either. This will also be a key focus in future China-U.S. negotiations. To sum up simply, because China has the ability to counter U.S. tariffs, it can use this as leverage to push the U.S. to lower tariffs on Chinese goods. In addition, there are some things worth mentioning about the tariff agreement reached between the US and Japan. The White House released a photo of Trump personally meeting with Japan's chief negotiator, Shigeru Kitamura. From the scene, you can see a large group of American officials sitting together with Kitamura, discussing the US-Japan tariff agreement with Trump. The real theme of this photo could actually be called Trump edits the draft. The photo was taken from behind Trump, capturing him holding a large card with the main terms of the US-Japan agreement in his hand. Doran wrote that Japan had originally promised to invest $400 billion in the United States, but Trump directly changed it to $500 billion, adding $100 billion on the spot. In fact, the agreement that was eventually reached raised the amount even further to $550 billion. Additionally, the original card stated that the profits from this investment would be split evenly between the US and Japan, but Trump changed it so that the US would take 90% of the profits, leaving Japan with only 10%. This photo was basically staged, with the purpose of showcasing Trump's victory, proving that Trump personally stepped in to negotiate this deal and secured overwhelmingly favorable terms for the United States. But this photo is actually full of flaws. First of all, this was supposed to be the scene of the US-Japan meeting, not a press conference. If everyone is just negotiating, why would there be these big cardboard props? Second, during negotiations, if you want to change a clause, you just say it out loud and see if the other side agrees. Why would you use a pen to change the numbers on everyone's papers? Changing the terms this way, if not just for a photo op, then what is it for? This is classic Trump-style showmanship. So exaggerated that he wants everyone to hear about it. Now America wins everything, Japan has to bow down, and then Trump brags on social media that this is the best deal ever. Basically, when Japan negotiates with the US, whatever Trump says, you just have to accept it. Japan's Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba is well aware of Trump's whole act, which is why Japan has kept a low profile about the US-Japan agreement. First of all, the agreement was only reached 2 days after the Japanese House of Councilors election ended. Japan didn't want to reach an agreement before the election, otherwise they were really afraid the Liberal Democratic Party would lose even worse. Secondly, after the agreement was reached, Japan's chief negotiator Toshimitsu Motegi went to the White House to meet with Trump. After the meeting, Trump posted online announcing the main terms of the US-Japan agreement. Motegi then posted on X saying the mission was accomplished, confirming the US and Japan had reached an agreement. Third, Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishikawa was initially low-key. When reporters asked him to comment on the US-Japan agreement, he delayed, saying he hadn't seen the specific contents. This was clearly just an excuse. During the negotiations, whenever there was any important clause, like Japan needing to increase its investment to $510 billion, Motegi would definitely call a recess right away to seek the Prime Minister's approval. If Shigeru Ishikawa didn't agree to the terms and conditions between Japan and the US, how could Motegi dare to reach an agreement with the United States? Ishikawa's claim of not knowing agreement specifics was an excuse. His initial silence stemmed from deep fear the Japanese public would view it as a humiliating, disgraceful deal. By keeping distance, he could observe market reaction and leave room to maneuver. If needed, he could even push Motegi to take the blame. Clearly, Shigeru Ishikawa didn't see this as a good deal for Japan. Yet, Japan went to great lengths to secure favorable terms. Japan's strategy was to use massive investments for more lenient terms from the US. So, how did this manifest? First, the 15% US import tariff. Shigeru Ishikawa later commented that this was the lowest rate. Second, Japan avoided reducing tariffs on all US imports to zero. Setting aside the UK, which has a trade deficit with the US, Vietnam received a 20% tariff rate by agreeing to zero tariffs, reducing the US's rate from 46% to 20%. Indonesia secured a 19% tariff rate by agreeing to zero tariffs and partial procurement, reducing the US's 32% to 19%. This reduction is significantly greater than Japan's, from the US's original 24% to 15%. Japan didn't dare to go for zero tariffs to protect its agriculture. The US seized on this weakness, pressing hard, demanding Japan increase investments in the US. Third, for agricultural imports, Japan will set a zero tariff on an annual import quota of 770,000 tons of American rice. Within this quota, Japan will increase its purchases from the US. It's estimated that the 770,000-ton rice quota amounts to less than $400 million a year, so the quantity is limited. In agriculture, the US made compromises, symbolically asking Japan for quotas, but the impact was limited. Tariffs on automobiles and auto parts were the main focus of negotiations. The US reduced its tariffs on Japanese cars to 15%. Previously, the effective tax rate on Japanese car exports to the US was 27.5%, original 2.5% base rate plus an additional 25% auto tariff. This reduction to 15% is a 12.5 percentage point drop. Japan secured better terms than the UK, as the UK didn't engage in repeated negotiations as Japan. But no matter what, Japanese car companies will have to swallow this 15% tariff themselves, and it won't be easy for them going forward. Japanese, Korean, and German carmakers are fierce competitors in the US market. Now that Japan and the US have reached an agreement first, Korean and German carmakers are immediately under more pressure, which will inevitably affect the negotiation stance of Korea and the EU. The EU concluded the China-EU summit in China, and besides climate, little progress was made. Now, the EU is about to enter tough negotiations with the US, hoping to reach an agreement before the August 1st deadline. The EU is now claiming that if no agreement is reached, it will impose retaliatory tariffs on €100 billion worth of US goods. The upcoming US-EU negotiations will definitely be the focus of attention from all sides. On the Pomegranate Channel's Current Affairs commentary, I'll discuss Trump's dissatisfaction with Federal Reserve Chairman Powell, and Treasury Secretary Bessenta gave three major reasons to stop Powell's firing.